From Chicago's CAN TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi, how you doing? How's your summer going? Hot enough for you? Welcome back to another edition of Chicago Newsroom right here on CAN TV. I'm Ken Davis. Two stories are dominating the news this week. The unrelenting, seemingly escalating youth violence in Chicago, leaving us with almost daily death tolls. And we feel like we have the highest youth murder rate of any city in America. And statistically, we might actually have that. Since 2008, more than 530 youth have been killed in Chicago, with nearly 80% of the homicides occurring in 22 African American or Latino community areas, according to the Chicago Reporter. And the Chicago Public Schools, they've decided to empty the piggy bank when the board votes on July 25th to approve the latest budget. And trust me, they will vote to approve the budget. They'll wipe out their $400 million reserve, something that is upsetting to Moody's, so much so that they downgraded the school's bond rating one full notch, pretty much about the same time they made the announcement. So is that an effort to improve the schools, or is it just a cynical political ploy to thwart union negotiations? Next Monday will be where we find out, because it's going to be a huge day. That's when the arbitrator releases the report and the findings on the pending teachers union contract. And last night, there were three very hastily called budget hearings that were held at different places, mostly around the South Side. There were some hisses, some boos, some pretty upset voices, but nobody pretends that the voices are going to be heard, so it doesn't really matter. Today, to help us understand these and all of these other stories that are going on right now, is Mike Rodriguez, who is with Enlace Chicago. Glad to have you with us, Mike. And first time on the show, glad you could join us. And joining us again is Art Golab from the Chicago Sun-Times. Art, you do a lot of research kind of work. You crunch numbers for the Sun-Times and stuff. So it would be, we thought it'd be really interesting to have you come in, because you've crunched all these things: violence, schools, everything. So we thought maybe it'd be a good idea to try to see if we could inject some actual facts into this conversation, if that's possible, to the extent that it's possible. So, Art, I don't know, I was at the Kennedy King hearing last night, and it was, I mean, if it weren't so serious, it would be comical. You had almost nobody there, because there was so little advance warning given, or notice given, that these things were going to happen. So you have your CTU members with their red T-shirts yelling at the board members, who are just kind of sitting there saying nothing, and then that was the end of it. So much for public process. What is the meaning of this emptying the piggy bank strategy? Doesn't as I understand it, CPS policy requires them to keep a couple $100 million in the bank?
I'm not sure about that, but I'm sure that they will find a way to make it legal.
Yeah.
$665 million was the deficit that they had to plug.
Mm-hmm.
And they have to find that money somewhere. And it just follows a long tradition of robbing Peter to pay Paul, and just kicking the can on down the line to the next year's budget.
That can gets kicked a lot around here.
I mean, we had a $1 billion reserved for the parking meter fund, and that's all gone now. And it was supposed to be saved for a rainy day, same as this Chicago Public Schools rainy day fund. So,
by the way, I was at the press conference where Mayor Daley answered that. He said, "It's raining. Can't you tell it's raining?" So
well,
maybe it's raining at the CPS right now too.
I guess it's a storm now.
Yeah.
They do need the money. They've got a contentious teachers union asking for more money, because they're being made to work more hours, and they got no raises at all last year. And they're being offered a 2% raise, which is actually included in this budget. And that's somewhat hopefully. They're kind of like rolling the dice that the teachers will accept a 2% raise.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a lot of this budget. It's hope. The other things that it does is it raises taxes to the maximum amount. I think it's around $50 million. Besides raising taxes, it takes about $76 million, and charter schools get a $76 million increase. And that's controversial, because every dollar that goes to a charter school is a dollar that doesn't go to a regular school that has union teachers. And that gets the teachers upset, that gets some parents upset because their kids aren't near a charter school or can't get into them.
That certainly was a big point of contention last night, and I know it's been one for a long time. That, and if I remember, I think Tim Cawley was on Channel 11 last night and said, "Yeah, that's what we're doing. We're putting the money in the charter schools. They're better. That's what the parents want. We're doing what the public wants."
Well, and what the teachers say is you're simply outsourcing education. And the teachers are saying, aren't you guys educators? Isn't that what we do? Why are we paying other people to do it? And that's their side of the story, and they don't like to see all this money being funneled off to charter schools, which are essentially private organizations. And not all of them are doing that well. In fact, it's very hard to find a charter school that has the same population as a public school that's actually doing better in terms of grades.
And that's been one of the big arguments, is that the CPS is essentially bleeding the neighborhood schools to death. They're just kind of like gradually letting them sink into the mire. Mike, your specialty, of course, is Little Village, right? That's your home. What are you hearing about the charter school environment? I mean, at first, a few years ago, charter schools were the big new shiny toy. Everybody wanted to have them. Now the luster seems to be coming off of them, but that's not true for the board. The board really believes in these things, and of course it should, because half of the board either works for or had something to do with or is economically tied with charter schools, so I guess that would explain that. But do you hear anything about that?
Well, I heard that we were actually experiencing an increase of 72 million for charter schools. So 76
I'm sorry, I may have the wrong number.
Oh, well, it might be 76,
Yeah.
but quite frankly, I think while I'm potentially going to be on a board of an alternative charter school, I think priorities within Chicago Public Schools are certainly put at question at the neighborhood level. Currently, we're going to have a longer school day. Where's the funding for the longer school day? We are going to have community school programs. After-school programs are in jeopardy and peril. Those are very important to our communities, particularly the Little Village community, where parents are working well past school closing hours, and youth need something proactive to do during those times between school letting out and parents coming home. There's issues with TIF dollars in the city of Chicago being funneled and skewed towards downtown interest versus local neighborhood schools. No increase whatsoever in funding for local schools, if I understand correctly the budget. While there's an increase, a substantial increase in the charter schools, I think that's certainly an issue, and it's certainly an issue that community members are bringing up and trying to tackle.
Well, I think we've seen a lot of that discussion, and there was certainly a great deal of that discussion last night, especially when you talk about the CPS administration says, well, by emptying the piggy bank, we were able to give you the thing that the CTU wanted, which is not increase the class size. But what CTU counters is, yeah, well, that's great, thanks for that. But this whole longer school day thing is the real issue. I mean, longer is not in and of itself better. I mean, that seems to be the real issue that we're trying to deal with here right now.
Well, there was some pushback on the longer school day from even Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago talked about a longer school year as being more effective at serving our youth. Part of that's being achieved, I think. So I give credit where credit's due as far as that's concerned. I think data shows that a longer school year, more instructional time, is a good thing for youth. I think that's accurate. I think we should push for more class time for our young people. But at the same time, I think we have a variety of concerns with high stakes testing, with the concentration in high stakes testing and the toll that takes on programming such as arts, such as sports and things of that nature that also make our youth more whole and ready to become good citizens in our city.
I talked to people last night at the hearing who were responding to CPS saying, and Art, you can correct me, you can inject facts here if you want to, but there is some money in the budget. There's like a discretionary fund for principals, right? That principals, they're going to put about 120 million or something. Again, I make no claim that my numbers are correct, but some number for principals to have discretionary money to spend in their schools.
Well, right, but principals don't have to spend it on art teachers or music teachers. They could spend it on increased security. They could spend it on more clerical help, better lunchroom. There's no hard and fast guidelines for them on how to spend this money.
Well, a couple of people that I was talking to last night were saying, yeah, but if you're a principal and you know that your job relies on the only thing we care about, which is higher test scores, then you're going to spend that money on doing something that's going to jack up test scores, not necessarily enrich the students' educational.
Despite this money for the principals, what I see on almost every neighborhood school is the position count going down.
Mm-hmm.
So that means less people working there. Now, that's not necessarily teachers, that's everybody. But you just see it across the board. And that can't be good. And I can guarantee you that they're not going to fill up all that time that they're increasing the school day with art and music or any subject that requires them to hire more teachers. It's just not happening. The teachers are, the number of teachers is going to go down a lot. What they are doing is extending the school day, so it's going to be more of the same. They're going to get more reading, they're going to get more math, all of that stuff that shows up on test scores, but does not necessarily produce a well-rounded student.
You know, this is something that I've had, it's kind of like a personal issue of mine, because I did some work when I worked for the city with a number of the programs that had to do with After School Matters, which was Maggie Daly's thing. And the guiding principle of After School Matters was that we're going to give kids something to do after school that's not more of the same. We're going to bring in theater or sculpture or radio production or whatever it is, something that's of interest to the kids. I saw a couple of things where they were doing building computers from scratch and stuff like that, that were really, you could see kids were really, really engaged in that in a way that I just can't imagine they're going to be engaged if they're going to have another 45 minutes of studying for the math test.
So Enlace, my organization, the Little Village community, runs 8 community schools in the area. Essentially, community schools are after-school programming for both adults but also youth to create a more well-rounded and better citizen students, if you will. Those programs include programs around arts, musics. There is some tutoring that goes on as well. But at the end of the day, we believe that our motto is so strong that it's taken schools out of probation, a number of schools out of probation, in conjunction with the school principal and the work that's going on within the school. I think that model is being put to jeopardy, really, with the longer school day and with priorities moving towards not increasing funding for teachers, not increasing funding for after-school programs, but increasing the school day. We were on the longer school day advisory committee. We fought hard to have a community voice at the table, and I think we did achieve a win with other folks like Raise Your Hand and other groups that were very integral in bringing this longer school day down a bit. But at the end of the day, I think priorities are what matters. You mentioned that the board of the CPS is a board that's made up of folks very invested in one ideology as far as schools are concerned. And granted, I'd like to say again, I'm for good schools. I think there are some good charter schools. I could think of a couple of schools that are excellent in achievement. But I think Art said it before, many of the charter schools in the city of Chicago aren't necessarily achieving at the rates that we would want them to. So, I think our priorities need to shift a little more. We need to be more focused on neighborhood schools, providing sound education and the wraparound services to make a good citizen student.
If you've been around for a while, you get to be a little cynical, and you think you can kind of understand some of the political maneuverings that are going on here. And when I first heard this thing about just shutting down the reserve fund, which it seems on its face to be just insane, My first thought was, oh, that's what they're doing. They know they've got two things that they just don't know what to deal with. They got this possible thing happening on Monday with the arbitrator, but in any case, the contract, whatever the CTU contract is going to do, that is probably going to cost them more money than the 2% that they've budgeted, no matter what happens. And then, of course, next year you've got this huge thing with the pension, another billion, here, a billion there, that has to, the years and years of neglect have to be cleaned up. And it strikes me that maybe one way to do that is kind of like throwing your house into foreclosure and just throwing the keys on the counter and moving out. That's almost what they're doing here. They're saying, sure, you can do whatever you want. We have no money. I mean, here, we've proven it. We have no money. Moody's has downgraded us. That's how bad off we are, right? So, I mean, am I being too cynical, or is this that kind of a
we're heading off way into uncharted territory.
That's okay. We do that on the
What
show.
we have are like
A disclaimer: Mr. Golab is headed into uncharted territory. His editors should not take any.
We're here for you, Art.
three
We'll
towns
support.
in California have, the third one just declared bankruptcy.
Yeah.
Okay. There's no precedent for that in Illinois. Illinois has different rules and laws. It's built into our Constitution that the taxpayers of the state are on the hook for those pensions. And there's really no municipality or government agency in Illinois has declared bankruptcy yet. So it could happen. It could be that maybe this is the first step, but it certainly would not be politically wise for a mayor who is invested in the school system.
Mm-hmm.
He is in charge. He has control of the board and appoints all those members. How does it look for him if his school system goes bankrupt on his watch?
Well, on the other hand, though, Art, we've had to endure for years I'm sorry, I almost said nonsense. This philosophy that government should be run more like business, right? I used to work in government, and it used to drive me nuts. It's sort of like, no, there's government and there's business. They're two very, very different. They exist for different purposes. Yes, there are lessons one can teach the other, but anyway, don't get me started. But okay, now we have a new mayor. He's very business-oriented, and he puts in a board that is very business-oriented. And what do these business-oriented board members do? They throw away the reserves. I mean, that's not, you couldn't do that if you were running GM, or, well, that's maybe not a good example, but,
Well, I think that's a good point. There's a lot of bad business practices.
GM is not required to have reserves.
Yeah.
Government agencies sometimes are.
Yeah.
And I think it's a case of desperate times calling for desperate measures, and they're desperate.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll see what happens. We should turn our attention to the other thing we wanted to focus on today, which, again, is one of these things that needs a good dose of reality checking and numbers, because there is panic spreading through the news media and other devices that the murder rate is way up, that there are shootings going on Michigan Avenue, that murders are happening in parts of the city that didn't happen before. We are the most violent city in the country. There was a statistic that somebody threw out the other day that 5,000 U.S. troops were killed in Afghanistan, or 2,000 in Afghanistan, but in the same time period, 5,000 people were shot on the streets of Chicago. You live and work in Little Village. Little Village has had its share of these problems. Put this into some perspective for me. Be a calming voice if you can, or at least tell me what we should be freaked out about.
Well, I'd just like to thank everyone for joining the panic that our community has had for quite some time here. Nothing like self-interest. When it's happening in your neck of the woods, you join the parade.
Yeah.
But in Little Village, as in the rest of the city, we have seen murder rates drop from historic highs in the 80s and 90s through the 2000s. But that dip in 2006, 7, and 8 that we saw is certainly creeping back up. And one murder is too many. So in 1999, there were 35 murders or homicides in the Little Village community, or the Little Village beats, as Chicago police counts them, police beats. And this past year, there was 15. But that 15 is up from 10 or 12 a couple years ago. So, you know, we want to get below that number.
Yeah.
We don't want any murders in our community.
Yeah.
So I think this is a citywide issue. And to connect this back to CPS,
I do think these things are very much connected.
I do want to give CPS some credit. I think they've done some good work around investing in some program that's producing results. For instance, their Community Watch program in Little Village, we've seen that really, really work. Some mentorship programs through CPS have been excellent. So I also want to give credit where credit's due. I think they have had a good focus on that, but it needs to be reinforced. But back on the local level, several months ago, there was a young lady, not a young lady, a baby, a 6-year-old by the name of Aaliyah Shao. It was a Saturday afternoon, a bright day, one of those beautiful March days that we had, and you know, she was gunned down and murdered. There's no reason for that to happen in our neighborhood or in our city, and I think it takes each and every one of us to really step up to and call this a city challenge. It's not just a Little Village challenge or Inglewood challenge. And you know, I'm glad people are waking up to the issue, but I think, you know, the frame on this issue needs to be the one in which every murder in the city of Chicago, or any murder in the city of Chicago, is a murder. Any murder in a neighborhood of the city of Chicago is a murder in the city of Chicago, and we should treat each and every one of them as if they're our own children.
All right, but I want you to address that we have this kind of like, we have the reality, which is very hard to define and get a hands on, and then we have the perception, which I think in the last few weeks, months, is like really getting out of control. It's getting freaked out. There is a narrative to which I subscribed, and I think a lot of other people in the media did, that the overwhelming majority of this crime, this murder, these shootings, were happening in a very concentrated area of the city, largely in the black community, frankly, but not all there. And that now that seems to be spreading. And that it's spreading, some are saying, because the gang structure is breaking down and you have all these kind of like individual freelancers out there with guns and they're just going around shooting people. Can you address that?
Well,
I know it's a ridiculous question.
Art's the number cruncher, so maybe he can address the numbers a little bit more.
That's what's happening. I mean, if you look at Inglewood, the highest crime area in the city, it stayed about the same. Where numbers spiked were on the southwest side and the south and southeast side, and a lot of those areas are mainly Hispanic. So another thing to put this into perspective is a lot of it, some people think, is due to weather. I mean, we had some of the hottest weather on record in February and March. And so those months, relative to last year, crime really spiked. And it's been kind of declining ever since, relative to last year, down to quote-unquote more normal levels.
So just Mark. So what you're saying is that if you look at today compared to this date a year ago, the numbers are not terribly much higher than they were a year ago.
Right.
Small
so
comfort.
We're still up overall 38% over last year in terms of murders.
But those are attributed
that was
to
a
the
higher
first
number.
3 months of the year.
Right. That was mostly loaded into the first 3 months. Now, I don't know how this current heat wave is affecting things, but it doesn't seem to be as much because it was hot last year, so there's not as much difference. But weather does play a big role. Another factor is these roving units, mobile strike forces, that under Superintendent Weiss, the previous superintendent, used to go around and address crime hotspots wherever they occurred. Well, now those have been taken off the table by the new superintendent, and Weiss was quoted in today's paper, or hinted in today's paper, that maybe that decision should be reconsidered. So that's another factor. Another factor is one of the new programs that Superintendent McCarthy has come up with, and that's the gang call-out, where they actually meet with gang leaders, police officials, and they say, if you guys start shooting people, we're going to go after you, and we're going to arrest every one of you. We're going to throw the book at you. And when the shooting has occurred, the police have followed through and done that. So one of the areas where this program was implemented was Inglewood. And that's one of the few areas in the city that did not show any spike in crime. So the police are trying to do some things. But yes, it is spreading out. It's going from the more traditionally high crime black areas and into Hispanic areas. And some of that may be due to this proliferation of smaller gangs that you mentioned, Ken. We call them the mom and pop gangs. You know, the feds have thrown all these corporate gang leaders into jail, and as a result, a lot of young Turks have risen up and started their own gangs, but they may only have a 2 or 3 block turf. And so there you've got more gangs fighting for turf, and that's going to equal more conflict. And so that is another one of these contributing factors. You know, so it's not just geography, it's not just ethnicity. There's a lot of factors at play.
You agree with that?
Yeah, I certainly do. I would say that I think the dynamics with gangs and gang lives and homicides and shootings within the African American community and Latino communities are a bit different.
Yeah.
So whereas the African American communities have gone away from these traditional gang rivalries, and many of the murders and homicides, I think you'd agree, are very much interpersonal, not necessarily gang related.
You dissed me, you dissed my girlfriend.
Right, very much interpersonal. Versus in Little Village, where you just have anonymous individuals crossing gang territory, shooting at anyone who looks like a gang member from the other group. But I would also agree with Art that, you know, in Hispanic communities, well, just think about the demographics of the city of Chicago. African American and Caucasian populations over the last 10 years have decreased dramatically in the city of Chicago, whereas Latinos have increased. So the Latino community is spreading out itself. So if we don't get a handle on the violence within the Latino community, you know, we might have some problems moving forward as well. I do know that the vast majority of murders are in African American communities. The Tribune in the July 12th paper.
Today, yeah.
I don't know when this is going to show. So
Chicago's victims.
July 12th.
Yeah, it's
You know,
to
what,
Chicago's
70?
victims overwhelmingly black, male, and young in the
Right.
analysis today.
But 17% of those victims are Hispanic as well.
Yeah.
And again, as I said before, one murder is too many. And we don't want that share to increase or the number of individuals who are murdered or to increase as well, or shot to increase. So I would agree really with what Art's saying as far as the numbers are concerned.
Well, you know, I think that's probably where we'll have to let this conversation drop, because the obvious next question is, what are we going to do about it? And we have about 40 seconds left. So I think rather than spend those 40 seconds being fools sitting here, we'll just let it go at this. But I think maybe we could reconvene this panel at some point and talk about okay, give me a one-sentence answer. Can the police resolve this problem?
I think the community can resolve this problem, and the police have to be a part of that response. In an era of diminishing resources, we need to be smarter about how we're effectively going after and laser focus on a group that's most likely to be the victims or perpetrators of violence.
So the issue about not having enough police on the streets, would more police fix this problem?
More police would help, but we have to be realistic. We might not get them, so we have to work smarter.
Okay. A word of wisdom from Art Golab. Thanks so much for being with us today, Art, and thanks Mike Rodriguez from Enlace Chicago for joining us on the program today. Some of these problems are so intractable, you don't know what to do. You, however, have been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV right here. And of course, you know that you can find us here on cable, but you can also watch us online. This address right down here is where you can watch the show anytime you want, and you can also subscribe on iTunes. And we are so glad that you joined us today, and hope you'll come back again next week for another edition of Chicago Newsroom. I'm Ken Davis, thanking you for joining us, and we'll see you next time here on CAN TV.